Oh, thank you so much, Kirsty. And it's so lovely to be here tonight. I hope everyone can hear me okay and see the screen okay. It's a very different world, isn't it, we now live in, that we've got to do everything online. And it's such a shame. When Kirsty and I talked originally about doing a talk, I was going to bring all the goodies up and we were going to have a display case. But unfortunately, we are where we are. So hopefully you can look at the pictures and enjoy it tonight. Thank you to Highland Archaeology Festival for inviting me to talk about the Iron Age Craftworking Centre of Culduthel. This well-preserved craft production site centre contained large-scale roundhouses, multiple workshops containing iron smelting furnaces and glass and bronze working hearths. The extensive artefactual assemblage contained a rich range of material, including craftworking tools, working waste and finished items, i.e. loads of treasure, guys, and you're going to see lots tonight. I'm sure you are all aware that the book has recently been published. Here's the front cover of it, with all the beautiful beads and some of the bronze objects as well on the front. So it's been published by the Society of Antiquaries, and it's generously been sponsored by Historic Environment Scotland, because I think this kind of assemblage could never be brought to light without some assistance from the Scottish Government. It will be available to buy online, I think, from Monday, 11th of October. I tried to buy it today, but it didn't let me. So I think it must be coming out on Monday. Without further ado, we'll get started. We've got a fair bit to cover, and I've not timed myself, so I'm hoping it's not. Oh, hold on. Okay. So I don't know how many of you are aware of where Culduthel is, but it's on the southern outskirts of Inverness, so just down here. Large-scale housing developments by Tulloch Homes all in this area would triggered a series of archaeological investigations by Headland from 2005 onwards. This elevated terrace is really interesting. So this terrace that runs all the way along here has been known as a focus of activity from early prehistory to certainly the medieval period. We've got this lovely Bronze Age short kist, which the National Museum's actually recently sort of covered or did a piece on. And it's, it's a fantastic find. It's got a beautiful beaker, 8 flint arrowheads, a bone toggle, amber beads, and a stone arm bracer, which the archer puts across his arm for doing archery, and 4 large gold caps. Beautiful stuff. So that was found on this terrace. And also we've got the Knockengale boar stone, which is a class 1 picture stone, which is found along this terrace as well. Got a nice boar and a mirror case. That's in the foyer of the Highland Council offices in Inverness. So this single large field here, which was formerly attached to Culduthel Mains Farm, was deemed to have high potential when it came up for development due to this crop mark here, which was, this photograph I think is taken in the 1970s. Of a palisaded enclosure. This was called the Old Town of Lees palisaded enclosure. So Headland went down and did an evaluation over the palisaded enclosure, just evaluation trenches and sort of the surrounding area. And they identified concentrations of archaeology all across this field, especially to the north and northwest of the palisade. So it was decided to strip the entire field, and what a great decision that was. So this is a plan of the stripped field once it had been fully stripped. So the stripping of the entire field, which Kirsty Cameron is responsible for, bless her cottons, showed that this was a well-preserved, multi-phase Iron Age settlement. The preservation is outstanding. That we've got at least 17 roundhouses here alongside multiple features associated with ferrous, i.e. iron metalworking. These remains appear to be surviving to an extent previously unseen in mainland Scotland, and certainly for a ploughed field like this, including multiple stone bases of iron smelting furnaces, intact stratified working surfaces, and vast spreads of this waste debris everywhere, slag material all over the site, and especially within this area along here, which was very, very well preserved. So Fraser Hunter of the National Museum took this photograph towards the end of the strip. The strip isn't complete. We've still got this lump to do here. The excavation, as you can see, has already started. You can see here, it gives a really good demonstration of the dark spreads of material around the largest and most complicated roundhouse. This is House 10 here, which I'll talk about quite a lot tonight. And also along here, you've got thick, dark spreads of material. These spreads that you can see here are spreads of waste debris. They're dumps of material containing vast quantities of slag, charcoal, residues from the iron, glass and bronze working identified on site. These deposits sealed and protected the archaeology underneath it, so that a large area of the craftworking site included stone bases of furnaces, paved areas, cobbled surfaces and upstanding stone walls. Iron Age upstanding stone walls on, in a ploughed field. It's quite phenomenal. So before we tuck into the goodies, I thought for you early prehistorians out there, I thought I'd give you a little bit of what was happening before we get to sort of this middle Iron Age, 2nd century BC to 2nd century AD kind of craftworking settlement. Although overshadowed by this middle Iron Age craftworking settlement, the site contained good evidence of early prehistoric activity in keeping with what we know about this terrace in general, in the form of pits. So this is site 5 here, that's our site, that's Culduthel here. And so we had a series of pits over this entire area with early Neolithic pottery and later Neolithic, well, a wee bit later as well, beaker pottery. This pitting suggested that the site was visited again and again throughout the Neolithic, potentially into the Bronze Age. And this activity, although pitting is so difficult to tell in the early prehistoric period what's going on, it potentially is associated with this rectilinear enclosure, which was found in site 9 here. So this may have been a ceremonial monument. You do see them in a couple of other places in Scotland, associated with mortuary activity during the Neolithic. So this may well have pulled people along this terrace to come back again and again and visit this mortuary enclosure. So, here we go. So also before we get to the Middle Iron Age settlement, there's also good evidence of an earlier Iron Age occupation, which stopped about 100 years prior to the establishment of the craftworking site. These features were sealed by a layer of hill wash. So if you look at the top here, you can see where you are on the site. And a lot of these features were sealed by a hill wash that then the craftworking centre was actually built upon. So we know that they're an earlier phase of activity unassociated with the Middle Iron Age craftworking. So we've got two roundhouses here, House 3 and House 5. House 5 is a post ring roundhouse, which is really large. If this is an outer post ring here, we're talking sort of 18 metres in diameter, overlaid at some stage by a ring groove roundhouse, which had a fantastic collection of saddle querns that have been incorporated into the fabric of the building during its construction, during its occupation, and then during its abandonment. So there's really interesting deposition of saddle querns going on. I mean, this alone would be a fabby site, wouldn't it, without what's coming? You've got a series of clearance cairns as well, which are probably suggestive that they're clearing fields for ploughing, for agriculture. And we've got the palisade enclosure, which we saw in that aerial photograph. This is undated, the palisade enclosure. It may have been part of this early Iron Age scheme. It certainly morphologically looks like it's probably part of this early Iron Age scheme. It's the absence of material that makes me think this is early Iron Age, because the palisade didn't contain any slag material, no ceramics associated with the craft working, no iron working, no glass or bronze working debris, suggesting that certainly by it was out of use by the time the craft working began on site, and it wasn't anything to do. And maybe this little group here, this early Iron Age group, is purely a sort of early farming settlement. They're clearing the fields, they're living in houses, and they're keeping their animals in a stock enclosure. So it's a nice little settlement in its own. So then we move on to our Middle Iron Age craftworking centre. This major period of settlement begins at some point after the mid-4th century BC. Dating is problematic, but I think we've probably narrowed it down to the 2nd century BC to the 2nd century AD that this activity is happening. The settlement is dominated by 10 similar workshop roundhouses, which are constructed across the terrace. They seem to be all sort of going this way, north, east, south, west, across that terrace. Many of these buildings contained the upstanding iron smelting furnaces constructed in stone, most of them with their final firings in situ. So we look down here at the quay, we've got the smelting furnaces are the yellow ones, and then the hearths are the red ones. So you can see how many furnaces we've actually got on site. It's quite significant. The quantity and uniform design of the workshops and the furnaces suggest that the site was a craft-focused settlement, primarily engaged in the manufacture of iron objects. The wealth of information that's been revealed about the iron manufacturing practices taking place on the site, from the excavation of the smelting furnaces and the analysis of the ferrous metalworking waste, including over 1/3 of a tonne of slag and other working vitrified debris. It's one of the largest largest assemblages of iron objects ever identified in Iron Age Scotland. It's vast. I mean, there's just so much stuff. So more than 150 iron objects were recovered, including a range of tools and weaponry, both produced on site, made on site in these furnaces and by these smiths, and also imported into site. This data set shows all stages of the ironwork. So from the reduction of the iron ore to the final kind of fine blacksmithing work was undertaken here. Concurrent with the manufacture of iron was evidence for a thriving and sustained glass and copper alloy industry, producing a wide range of goods, glass beads, enamelling, and decorative metalwork on stone-lined hearths and within a stone-walled workshop. While the output of these highly specialist crafts appears to be much smaller than the iron, the assemblage of objects and waste indicate that Culduthel was a substantial producer of glass and bronze objects in the region at this time. So a little note on dating here. Dating is difficult for Culduthel. We only took 32 radiocarbon dates, which seems utterly foolish now. You've got to remember that most of the post-excavation analysis was done about 2007, 2008. And yeah, it just wasn't as well refined, the radiocarbon dates, as it should have been. So the 32 radiocarbon dates taken across the whole site, each came from one single fill of a feature, and really you should be looking about getting 2 or 3 from one fill of a feature to kind of corroborate these dates. So the majority of the dating I'm going to talk about tonight, I'm only really talking about the final in situ firings of the furnaces. So the last bit of charcoal, the last bit of wood that is surviving in these furnaces, which I consider to be primary dates, i.e. as reasonable as possible. Those radiocarbon dates represent the final firings of those furnaces. One of the glass working hearths as well has a final firing date as well. There is supporting evidence from artefacts, which we will talk about, but we can't pin it down as well as radiocarbon dates can do if we taken more. So I'm going to start off by sort of taking us round the site a little bit, getting us a bit more familiar with what's going on. So I'm going to start with post-ring roundhouses, get them out of the way quick. So 4 post-ring roundhouses, 1 here and 3 along this edge here, were identified amongst these workshops with their porches. 3 of them, 17, 9 and 7, appear to potentially predate the craftworking settlement, but equally they could have been clean workshops. They don't have any iron, they don't have any slag in them, they don't have any furnaces in them. I mean, they could have been for leather work, textile work. They could have been domestic housing associated with the settlement. It's very hard to say. House 10 stands out here, and I'm going to talk more about House 10 later on in the talk, so I'll leave him well alone. I wanted to talk about House 7. So we're over here. Now, House 7, it's not a very exciting roundhouse in its own right, but it's the most interesting of these roundhouses. So a short dagger, here we go, an iron short dagger was identified set into one of the internal post holes. And this dagger is likely to be made on site. I mean, weaponry in general is very, very rare this time in the Iron Age. These, we've got a couple of daggers on site actually. But it's a really interesting piece. It's been damaged on one side during its lifetime, and it was resharpened not long before it was buried in the ground. And one of the interesting things about the dagger is it had brown corrosive material all over one side of the blade, which is probably from leather, suggesting that it was sheathed before it was deposited. So this is a very careful deposition, vertically deposited in this post hole. It's very carefully placed there. We're going to talk more about structured deposition as we go on, but yeah, it's a very interesting idea. So So the iron smelting workshops, the ones I've circled here, these 5 are remarkably similar roundhouses. Workshops 2, 13, 15, 16 and 19 were identified across the site in this period. Each was constructed from a single post ring and 4 had a porch. 4 of them have got a porch extending some way out from the main structure. Each contained the surviving stone bases of furnaces used to smelt iron, some of which had been repeatedly replaced over time. Most of these furnaces were located at the entrance or close to the entrance to the buildings, and they appear to be integral to the design and function of the workshop. Another 2 very similar buildings, workshop 6 and 12. There's 12. I always lose 6. Oh, there's 6. So 12 is very similar, and 6 you can't really see the front end; it's not there. These were probably also iron smelting workshops. Workshop 12 contained a hearth associated with metalworking, potentially a disturbed furnace, not a stone base that wasn't surviving. And workshop 6 had a thick spread of material which was rake out from a nearby iron smelting furnace. So I presume it's underneath the bulk here; you can't see it. A further 3 buildings had identical porch and ring design, but contained no furnaces or ironworking material. Workshop 8, which is pretty small, Workshop 18, which is again teeny weeny, and Workshop 22. Given the similarities in design, these buildings are likely also to have functioned as some sort of workshop space, maybe clean workshops for iron and leather or textile, maybe to do with polishing and finishing of items. I mean, we'll never know. There wasn't any material to suggest what they functioned as. So I'm going to focus on a couple of these 5 iron smelting workshops with in situ furnaces to give you an idea of their layout and design. I'm going to start with workshop number 2. Okay, so this is beautiful, isn't it? Just beautiful. Look at that. That is a furnace base. So this is one of the sort of a classic workshop from Culduthel. It's got a northeast facing porch. It contains a well-preserved base of an iron smelting furnace, located just inside this post ring. It's constructed from 4 large edge-set stones in kind of a horseshoe shape. These are blocking stones at the entrance. The basal fill gave a date of sort of 1st century BC to 2nd century AD, which is kind of standard. So it's got slag. It had slag within it. It had clay superstructures. It had these conical tuyeres, these clay nozzles which would have gone on the end of which would have been for air to be forced into the furnace. We found them all over the site. Interestingly, Workshop 2 also had this glass bead in it, this pink glass bead, which there was glass beads all over the site. So we just assumed this was an ancient glass bead, but apparently it's not. It's a modern pink glass bead. So there you go. So I'm going to look at another couple of workshops, and then I'm going to talk about what actually iron smelting is and what happens. So stay with me on this. So workshop 15 is another workshop, very similar, with an in situ smelting furnace. Workshop 15, so it's a similar design to workshop 2, but it's got a northwest facing porch. The bases of 3 identical iron smelting furnaces were located just inside the entrance. The earliest furnace is this middle one here, with a horseshoe shaped stone setting. This complex of furnaces, they're not going to have been used at the same time. One would have gone out of use, and then they've built another one, and then they've built another one. So this indicates that you've got intense periods of iron smelting, potentially over considerable periods of time. I mean, these smelting furnaces could last, probably about 100 firings, maybe even more. So they're obviously using them and then rebuilding next to them and rebuilding next to them. So it shows that the industry is, it's intense over some period of time. Workshop 15, just to its northeast, is also an interesting workshop with a complex history to it. So again, you've got a single post ring roundhouse. This was originally would have had a porch facing in this direction, similar to the other ones in the northeast. It had the stone base of an iron smelting iron smelting furnace, rectangular this time, more rectangular this time, set in a suboval pit. And we've got a single date for this, which is sort of similar to what we've seen before, 2nd century BC to the 1st century AD. And then at some point in time, this all went out of use and they changed the direction. I don't know why. They changed the direction of the porch to the southwest. And then they built an iron smelting furnace in this porch area, very similar again. So the final firing of that is potentially a little bit later, 90 BC to 80 AD. So you can see how these could easily just not survive the plough. You know, these are things that, you know, if that hadn't been preserved with this layer of material over the top of them, they would have just been knocked out by the plough. It's amazing what we must lose from ploughing. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about Workshop 19, which again is a really interesting one. Now, Culduthel, probably, I don't know how many of you know this, it wasn't completely excavated from the strip that we've seen due to time constraints. This area in the north was stripped and it was planned, but the developer said that this was going to be a green area, a green space, whether that meant a garden or just a play area within the housing development. So not very much was actually excavated in this area. Workshop 19, it was planned, and the stone base of the furnace was left unexcavated, unfortunately. A post hole, there's only a few of these post holes were actually dug, but one post hole located in the post ring contained an iron hook mount. So this is a type of belt fitting, certainly made on site, all these things. And then, and then just outside of the workshop, we have a very, very similar iron dagger set into a post hole. Vertically set, very similar in shape and design to the dagger that we saw at House 7 as well. So very interesting to see that kind of structured deposition running across the site, this deposition of these daggers sort of almost thrust into these post holes. I don't know whether the post hole's dug and the post is in situ and the dagger is thrust, or whether this is done post depositionally. It's very hard to tell. But there it is, blade in situ, there. Imagine finding that, it's beautiful, isn't it? So, what are these iron smelting furnaces? I will explain a little bit more. This is my friend Sarah Jane excavating one of the furnaces. Beautiful, beautiful furnaces. The exceptional preservation of 7 iron smelting furnaces, along with a large assemblage of iron objects and waste material recovered from the site, demonstrate that the craftworking settlement was highly organised and it specialised in the production of iron and high-quality natural steel. This evidence has illuminated many aspects of the cycle of iron manufacture undertaken on site, from the initial smelting of the ore to the finishing of the objects. The iron objects show the activities the community was undertaking. The tools indicate a wide range of crafts was practiced. Building materials were being manufactured, weapons were being made and repaired. Some finds, which we've not talked about yet, such as the chariot linchpin, daggers, the daggers we've just talked about, and the spearhead, are rare finds for Iron Age Scotland. This suggests that the community was of some status. Iron ore and charcoal are the main resource required for the manufacture of iron. No ore was recovered on site, and this must have been stored outside of the excavation area. The ore was likely to be bog ore, which is widely available throughout the wetlands of Europe in the Iron Age. This may have come from the now drained peat moorland on the southeast of Culduthel, Drummossy Moor. The charcoal was most likely coming from managed or semi-managed woodlands surrounding the sites. So how do you make iron from bog ore? The primary process for preparing iron ore for smelting is to roast it in a fire to remove unwanted material and break it into manageable lumps. This process is also absent from the archaeological record at Culduthel, so it's clearly being undertaken elsewhere. The next stage is smelting, which is what we've got on site. The smelting furnaces were all freestanding, non-tapped furnaces that produce bloomery iron. To produce iron within a non-tapped smelting furnace, the fire is first started in the base of the furnace, the slag pit, with the ore and the charcoal placed into the shaft above. The ore and the charcoal would be heated together, and the slag would gradually form in the pit. To reach the required temperature for smelting, 12,000 degrees centigrade. Bellows would be used to blow air into the furnace, with the colour of the flame indicating when conditions suitable for reduction were reached, a process that would take hours. So they're in these little workshops for hours and hours, heating up these furnaces and blowing into them with bellows. So it's a constant, you have to constantly watch this. Once cooled, the spongy metallic iron slag, the bloom, could be removed from the base of the furnace. The iron bloom, once completed, the iron bloom would first be required to be consolidated through primary smithing to remove impurities prior to the final processing of shaping the iron to form bars, billets and objects. So this iron bloom that's removed from these smelting furnaces then goes through another kind of smithing process, and then it goes on to go to the smith effectively and to produce objects. Each of the iron smelting furnaces were remarkably consistent in form and appear to have been built following an established design. Each was built into a subcircular or subrectangular pit, with the edges of the pit lined in this horseshoe shape arrangement of water-worn boulders or slabs bonded with clay. Built onto this stone base would have been a thick-walled clay superstructure, which we've got a reconstruction of here. The clay chimney would have been constructed by moulding wet clay around a round wood withy frame and the stone base. Evidence for the clay superstructure in the form of furnace walls and rims were identified as fired clay fragments found within the interior of the furnace and adhering to the upper sides of the stones with preserved wattle impressions. So there was a fantastic range of evidence showing exactly how these non-tapped smelting furnaces worked. So what are they making? Oof, they're making a lot of stuff. The iron working from Culduthel is one of the largest Iron Age iron assemblages from Scotland, with over 150 finds. The wide range of finds casts a light on the spectrum of activities on this site and includes many of that are rare and unique. And there is so many, it's kind of hard to get your head around it. The range of tools, especially for metalworking, the weaponry, the unusual linchpin all merit a special mention, while the offcuts and unfinished items give a vivid picture of the blacksmithing process. So we've got key groups here. We've got the tools, so show a wide range of craft activities: iron and bronze smithing, wood and leather and textile working, agriculture. We've got a scythe here. There's a nice scythe. We've got fine tools such as small punches for decorating leather or bronze working, scribes for laying out designs, gravers for engraving, snips for, where are the snips? There they are. For potentially cutting up copper alloy sheets, or for textile or leather working. We've got a small axe for sort of fine woodworking. We've got weapons, as discussed, these 2 daggers, and we've got a small spearhead. These are really rare finds for Scotland, and their intact nature suggests that they're sort of deliberately votively deposited. They're likely to be pre-Roman Iron Age weapons. We've got a chariot linchpin showing transport is, being made. Chariots are being made. We've got needles. We've got embossing tools. We've got a curved blade, potentially for surgical surgeries. So it's almost, gobsmacking. It's quite something, isn't it? So alongside all this amazing evidence, we also have evidence that they're making glass. Sorry, they're secondary working glass, and also they're making copper alloy objects. So glass and copper alloy working debris, including droplets, rods, flakes of glass, crucibles, clay molds, castings and casting debris, and finished or partially finished objects such as glass beads and decorative metalwork were recovered from a concentrated area of the site down here. So their distribution shows that the manufacturing hub for glass and copper alloy objects was with 3 hearths, 2 are shown here, and a turf-walled U-shaped workshop. The chronology of these industries is not well understood, but a single radiocarbon date from the final firing of one of the hearths shows that these events took place at some point between the 2nd century BC and the early 1st century AD. This date is tentatively supported by the bulk of copper alloys identified on site, which were mainly pre-Roman Iron Age leaded bronze recipe. and a 2nd to 1st century BC copper alloy sword hilt discarded in a nearby cobbled yard, and which may have been brought there to site to recycle. So yeah, this evidence, and especially the way that we sampled this and excavated it, because the evidence was very, very minimal, especially for the glass working, where you've got these teeny flakes of glass. So the sampling strategy was very key here. So we're going to focus on the glass manufacture first. Glass working material, as I've described, the small flakes, droplets or fragments of rods or bars, was restricted to this hearth, this paved hearth here, 2434, and its internal deposits, a distribution that suggests that only this hearth was used for glass working. Single radiocarbon date from this hearth, from the final firing just over these paved slabs, indicates that glass manufacture was taking place between the 2nd century BC and the 1st century AD. So what are they making? Oh, they're making such beauty, such treasures. So glass is arriving onto the site as recycled objects or imported ingots. It's not being made, it's not a primary glass making site. So it's all coming onto site as secondary items to then be melted down. And then they would melt them down, the glass workers would melt them down and shape the molten glass into various forms. The paved hearth would have been ideal for this task. Most of the beads recovered from the site were made at Culduthel, and presumably within hearth 2434. Some of the single beads, one of the blue beads, and the black and green bead, and this blue and white spiral, which is an imported Roman piece. These are all characteristically Roman, and they're being brought onto site, imported, presumably as to be melted down and used, like this one, for decoration. But all the rest of these objects were made on site. Okay, so in the same general location, all 3 hearths contained evidence of non-ferrous casting debris. So this is for copper alloy manufacture. So we've got things like a mould here and a mould here. This is for pouring in the molten copper alloy. And we've got the crucibles here and here, these little bowls, which would have been for melting the copper alloys. So this assemblage suggests that these 2 hearths are used for copper alloy manufacture. And this building, this strange U-shaped building, there's not much left of it, but it's probably a turf-walled kind of workshop. It might have been U-shaped, it might have been open at this end, it might have been unroofed, it might have been more of a sort of windbreak. The distribution of glass beads and copper alloy waste and objects also suggests that workshops 13 and 15, or the areas where they stood, may have been utilised during the manufacture of glass and bronze objects. So this is quite a tight little area where they're producing glass objects and where they're producing the bronze. So the ironworking is all over the site, and this is just one little discrete area where they're doing these 2 particular tasks. So what are they making? Oh, they're making beautiful things. Evidence for what they're manufacturing on site is quite slim, however, as many of the moulds we found were too fragmentary to identify what objects were being cast. Elements of the bronzesmith kit used to finish both objects and sheetwork suggest that fine decorative objects were being made. These include fine snips for trimming pieces, files for filing stuff down, gravers for engraving stuff, tracers for chasing them out, and scribes and punches for laying out designs. A fine bar ingot, a reused quern mould. Oh, that is previous page actually. This one here. Sorry. And the concentrations of sheet working debris show that casting to create rough outs for sheet working was undertaken. So they might do sheet working and make, vessels, for example. An unfinished harness strap, this one here, unfinished harness strap junction, and several other items, a toggle, a projected ring-headed pin, along with a failed casting of a possible ring, suggests the site was creating exceptionally decorative pieces. The style indicates that they were made by craftsmen with extensive knowledge of different regional and national artistic styles that were influenced by both Britain and the Roman world. And this would have had enamel. These are all awaiting enamel, these cells, which would have been done on site by the glass workers. So it's just fabby. So we've had a look at the craftworking, Middle Iron Age craftworking site, and we've had a look at the ironworking, and we've had a look at the glass, and we've had a look at the copper alloy. So I'm now going to go on to what happens later on in the site. So in the 1st to the 3rd centuries, there does seem to be some developments, some changes in the site. I don't quite know why, but certainly there is a distinct new phase. Now, this may well be going on while everything else is going on. I don't think this is separate to the Middle Iron Age craftworking settlement. I think the workshops are all there. Everything is up and running. These are just later developments, if you like. So this is heralded, this is probably around the 1st to 3rd centuries AD, or really probably the 1st to 2nd AD. Again, dating is problematic. We've got the construction of 2 large, distinct ring groove roundhouses of similar design. House 10 here and House 4 here. And they herald the final phase of occupation of the craftworking settlement. Both houses were incredibly rich in artefacts, the majority seemingly deposited during or after their abandonment. Most were tools or debris associated with the craftworking activities of the settlement, but some were high-status imported objects, which imply this 1st to 3rd century AD bracket for occupation of this phase of the site. For House 10, we shall see this deposition was a series of deliberate and carefully curated acts with an assemblage of exceptional items, including Roman coins, a Roman brooch, and an unfinished strap mount. A tight grouping of copper alloy sheetworking fragments recovered from House 4 also suggests that they've kind of done a deliberate cachet of sort of deliberately depositing a cachet of copper alloy sheetwork in the house. Immediately to the east, southeast of House 10 was a cobbled yard that had been repeatedly repaired during the occupation. A fragment of another cobbled yard, which I think is less well understood, was found quite far to the southeast of House 4 as well. But this sort of suggests that we are missing a lot of activity. You know, the plough has probably taken a significant chunk of this settlement. It was undoubtedly a lot larger. This just happened to survive this cobbled surface. So we're going to look at House 10 first. House 10 started its life as a simple post ring roundhouse. It had then been replaced by another post ring roundhouse, slightly smaller in size. And then in its final phase, in this 1st to 3rd century AD, the house was completely transformed into a huge, massive, very large ring groove roundhouse, complete with paving, an external apron wall. So its paving is here. This is like proper nice paving. And you can see that here. Nice kind of entrance paving when you come in the house. You've got your paved area to take your boots off. It's got an elaborate porch, and it's got an external apron wall of turf and stone, which might have been quite tall in height, sort of hugging the outside of a wooden house. This house was a multi-phase building that had been modified and enhanced over time and could, in theory, have been upstanding for generations. In its primary form, the external wall was defined by this narrow ring groove. You can see that here, with a roof supported by inner post, ring post, comprising of really large posts, many over a metre in diameter. At a later stage, the northeast facing porch was paved, and an external turf and stone wall was built to effectively encompass the house. The most dominant feature within the interior of the house would have been this massive ring ditch here. Humongous ring ditch. This was a deliberately cut complex feature with stone and wooden partitions within it. It's got floors. In places it had steps stepping down into it. It's a subterranean chamber within the house. It's not known what activity was going on in here, but it may well have been used to store precious items. It may well have been used as different workshop spaces if it's partitioned off. I mean, yeah, it's hard to say, but it's a fantastic thing. It shows that it's being used by people. So you get a sense of size, I think, from this photograph of house 10 under excavation. Obviously, you've got 2 earlier houses on this site, so it's kind of, there is a lot going on here, but you can see the outer ring groove here. I mean, it's absolutely massive, huge entrance post. You've got nice flagged surface. You've got this inner post ring here. So it's huge. It's 18 metres in diameter, which is really big for an Iron Age roundhouse. It's been modified in appearance over time, and this embellishment of Iron Age roundhouse by extending and widening the walls is seen throughout Scotland in both timber and encased in stone. The additional walling may have been constructed to enhance or alter the appearance of the building, potentially to create higher walls, or at least the kind of view that there were higher walls. These modifications may have been done to mark significant moments within the household, such as new ownership, or to memorialise important community events. They could have been done for practical structural reasons. If, as postulated, House 10 stood for several decades or longer, generations, the stability of the timber superstructure may have become weak over time. The archaeological record shows that posts had certainly failed and been replaced in the inner post ring. So the turf and stone apron may well have been constructed to give additional support to the sagging outer wall and to further insulate the now decrepit building. So yeah, it's a fabby building. So the use of the building, so a lot of different things were found. There was 3 different types of Roman vessel glass found in a pit, which suggests that that they were using glasses to drink their wine of an evening, which is quite a nice thought, certainly in this final phase of the house. And the disuse is quite something of this building. So artefacts were incorporated into the primary backfill of the ring ditch. And these appear to be deliberately deposited within this ring ditch. And their presence may suggest that the cellars were used to store the community's most precious items. The ring ditch with this deliberately deposited material contained an iron sickle, beautiful, 3 copper alloy Roman coins, a probable shank of a copper alloy ring-headed pin, beautiful stuff. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the abandonment of the house at this stage, and then I'm going to go back to a little bit more about that kind of final later 1st century AD to 3rd century AD development. So the final deposition of artefacts at House 10, the house itself was a decrepit building, but the entrances and the walls were still clearly visible on the ground. This deposit here was dumped in, but it's obviously being bounded by something. But this final deposition is puzzling because it's covering the entire internal post ring, and the house must have been a roofless shell when this deposition was done. But the layer, as I said, is sitting within the bounds of the building. The outer walls must have still formed some sort of physical barrier. So dumped in this abandoned shell of a building were several items of high status unusual artefacts, including an imported copper alloy Romano-British enamel plate and fantail brooch, which is just beautiful. The unfinished copper alloy cruciform harness strap mount, which was clearly made on site. A miniature iron axe for woodworking and coiled lead objects. These items again appear to represent industries that were once present on site alongside a prestigious non-local item, which must have been treasured by individuals both for its intrinsic value and for its ability to demonstrate cultural identities and connections, this Romano-British enamelled plate and fantail brooch. The departure from the house must have been planned. I mean, this looks like a planned event, and the range of objects carefully curated, as they were clearly chosen for their individual symbolic value and their significance as a collection of memories to the community, the industry and the individuals. The deposition of manufacturing items in the ring ditch, the iron fragments, the tools, the copper alloy ring-headed pin, the strips of copper alloy directly symbolises the death of the industries on site. In House 10, these items were buried alongside the 3 Roman coins, clearly valuable and significant items to the craft worker. To bury items in this way at this location could be recognised as similar to Iron Age deposition rituals seen in culturally or naturally significant foci, such as caves or springs or early prehistoric monuments, as they must have deliberately been brought on a journey for burial within the surviving footprint of this house. The site of the building metamorphosized into a shrine, and the abandoned settlement transformed into an ancestral landscape of special meaning. In other words, they've deliberately come back to this site to do this well after the end of the lifetime of this particular building. It's quite something. I've never seen anything like this before. So that's kind of the life cycle of House 10. I wanted to take you right up to sort of the end of it, because it's quite a unique building, and kind of, you know, all the things that happen to it are quite special. So go back to this kind of 1st to 3rd century development of the site before its abandonment, this kind of final development of the site. We've talked about the abandonment of House 10, but we'll talk about the development at this later stage. So while House 10 was still upstanding and people were living in it, a cobbled surface was laid immediately to the east of it. The yard had been repaired and resurfaced in places. I mean, these are the kind of things that we just don't find on archaeological sites. Cobbling is, you know, the first thing to go. You know, there must have been hard standing cobbled surfaces throughout prehistory, and it's not something you see very often. I don't think I've ever troweled a cobbled surface like this, apart from, you know, on a Brock site where you've got that kind of level of stone preservation. It's quite exceptional. A total of 8 kilograms of iron slag was either incorporated into the top of the cobbles, along with large fragments of burnt clay with adhering slag. The yard was rich in iron artefacts as well, including offcuts, a diamond-shaped rove, a nail. The most outstanding artefact was a copper alloy decorated sword hilt guard, which is this guy here. The first hilt guard found in northern Scotland, and probably dating to the 2nd to 1st century BC. Its location and wear suggests the sword may have been stripped down to be re-hilted, and the old hilt was discarded in the yard, perhaps awaiting recycling in one of the hearths close by. Amazing, eh? So House 4 was very similar to House 10, and of the same period, this 1st to 3rd century AD kind of final development. It's another substantial ring groove roundhouse of similar design. It's nearly as big. It's 17 metres in diameter. And again, this it's got this wonderful ring ditch with all this sort of flagstones, steps, walls. You know, there's a lot going on in these ring ditches, which suggests that they're either little workshops, they're storage areas, they're, you know, they're spaces that are used. So very, very interesting spaces. It's not as rich in artefacts, House 4, as House 10 was, but the uppermost fill of this ring ditch did have a cache of copper alloy items, including copper alloy strips and sheets and part of a vessel, represented by 2 fragmentary sheets held together with 3 rivets. So it did have this little kind of pocket of stuff. So at the end of the life of this wonderful site, it's quite clear the kind of abandonment of the site, because spreading over the entire eastern side of House 10, this is House 10 here that we've talked about, and the cobbled surface beside it that we've talked about, was a vast spread of black silty loam with abundant fire-cracked cobbles. And if you remember that first aerial photograph we looked at, that big black splodge, that is this. It completely covered the cobbled yards, the glass and copper alloy workshops and hearths, and workshops 13 and 15. This abandonment spread was likely the spoil heaps from the industries itself, and this whole spread contained large quantities of iron slag and other metalworking debris. Over 40 kilograms of iron slag was recovered during the hand excavation. We didn't hand excavate this whole thing. We only sort of did pockets of it. The sample was estimated to be 5 to 10% of the total iron slag contained within this spread. So we didn't even touch the sides. Numerous fragments of burnt clay were also retrieved, many identified as the cast-off from those furnace superstructures, the big clay chimneys I was talking about. There was also 29 iron objects, including square section rods, the projected ring-headed pen you can see here, several tools, iron offcuts, a hook mount, which is a belt fitting, and nails. So yeah, this is one of the first things we obviously excavated on site, because we start from the latest, and this is kind of what was immediately apparent getting onto site and seeing this spread of material, this thick, dark spread of material containing just loads of iron and loads of slag. It's just, I've never seen anything like it in my life when we arrived on site. It was just outstanding, just quite something else. So, how do I conclude? So, I do conclude quite length in the book about Culduthel. I think it's it's obviously an affluent and well connected site. It was established in earnest with the construction of a series of purpose-built workshops, many containing these iron smelting furnaces, and 4 post-built roundhouses. It was active between the 2nd century BC and the early to mid-2nd century AD, with most production possibly, although dating is a problem, possibly taking place in the late 1st to early 2nd centuries AD. It looks like it's primarily for iron production. It's manufacturing and repairing iron tools, weapons, fixings, fastenings, and other pyrotechnic industries are also ongoing. Secondary glasswork, the casting of bronze, the production of metalworking ceramics, including crucibles and moulds. Iron tools recovered from the site also show that organic crafts are probably going on, including leather and woodwork, textile work, which could have all been produced in tandem with the metal and glass objects. So you really are getting an idea that this is a craft centre. It's a craft working centre. They are doing the lot. If you want a sword, if you want a dagger, you get the hilt as well. If you want a chariot, you get the wheels and the leather work and the iron work. You're getting absolutely everything. I think it's purpose-built. It looks like it's a sort of purpose-built centre. The layout of the craft-working settlement certainly gives me the impression that the majority of the workshops could have coexisted as a contemporary group. This arrangement alongside their uniform design and identical furnaces indicates certainly to me that the entire enterprise appears like it was established following a predetermined scheme. It just looks so well planned. Does this evidence then suggest the site was built and controlled by a chief or a head craft worker or under the patronage of a local elite? I don't know. Or does it reflect the site had kind of been relocated from a previously established craftworking centre or the industrial quarter of a domestic setting that they'd outgrown? So it's very difficult to say, but it looks like it's plonked there as a one-off. It doesn't look like it's kind of built up over time. It does look like a planned thing. So yeah, the structured deposition is something that I kind of do go on about quite a lot in the book, but I think it's just such an interesting thing. We've got the structured deposition in House 4 and remarkably in House 10, but also in Workshop 19 and House 7, we get these daggers as well. And you get a very strong impression that the community at Culduthel you're getting some of their day-to-day ritual practices undertaken possibly as part of day-to-day life to mark important stages in the lives of the building and those who dwelled within them. The 2 kind of separate ceremonies to decommission the grandest building on site, with the ring ditch being backfilled first of all, and then later on this abandoned shell of a building being revisited and almost ritually dumped of material within it. The 2 separate ceremonies to decommission the grandest buildings on site, House 10, are the most striking here, but in all the buildings, the structured deposition items was clearly well planned, and these are complex events where rare and precious items were carefully selected and grouped together as offerings to reflect potentially significant events in the life of the house, its occupants, and the wider community. I mean, now we might just send a birthday card, but back then, you buried a Roman coin. I don't know. It seems like it's the way to mark events. The connections to the Roman world also really stand out, especially in this part of Scotland in this time. We've got the Roman glass, which we can see was supplied ready-made with the preformed blue and white cable or trail for inlay into beads. And some of the beads are imported as specialist components onto site as well. The source of the copper is unknown, but the majority of the lead is coming from southwest Scotland. But via a series of cross-country trading networks, you can't help feel that potentially that's got Roman connections as well. Other Roman goods are coming to site as well. The majority of these, the glass beads, the brooch, the glass vessels, these are conforming to a kind of type of luxury Roman material seen on many Scottish Iron Age sites in this period. They relate to feasting and personal adornment. So they're kind of fitting in with their neighbours as well. You see it at Burney, you see it at Clerkley Hill. They're kind of, everyone wants to be seen to have the ability to access this Roman material. It's very important to them. Oh, before I leave that slide, I just wanted to say that this is a possible reconstruction of one of the houses. We didn't do a lot of reconstruction work, unfortunately, but this is house 10. So everybody needs good neighbours. I'm not going to say too much. You'll have to read the book. Yeah, you will actually have to read the book to find out about the potential connections with other sites. I've looked across the kind of Moray Firthlands, but it's key to say that Culduthel was not isolated in this period. Certainly not. The connections are there to be seen. Both the settlements of Burney and Clerkley Hill. So Burney is 14. Is that Burney? Yes. And Clerkley Hill's 12, isn't it? Yeah. So it's there and there. These two settlements are potentially contemporary with the site. They're also high status sites. They're also making iron and copper alloy goods. They're also building large scale ring groove roundhouses. They're also importing Roman goods. They're also burying things within their houses and pits as part of kind of their everyday sort of structured deposition of their life, as it were. So we've also got the glass manufacturing site at Culbin Sands as well. Which has never been excavated. We have a lot of beads and a lot of material from Culbin, but we've not actually got any sort of in situ hearths to suggest exactly what's going on here. But certainly it's got evidence for identical Class 8 and 13 beads being manufactured, the same as what's being manufactured at Culduthel. So I think Culduthel is probably one of a number of regional manufacturing centres around the southern shores of Moray Firth, and potentially just banging out iron as day-to-day life for the extended region, but also producing glass beads, enamelling goods, producing really high quality, high status items for exchange and trade. So yeah, and sharing of resources and skills as well. Potentially the glass workers or the copper alloy workers at Culduthel may well have made their way to Burney, Clerkley Hill. The glass workers may well have come over from Culbin Sands. I see that there is networks here to develop, and hopefully I do develop that a little bit more in the book. So you'll have to buy the book. Okay. I'm just going to finish off by saying no woman is an island, nobody is an island, and the professional archaeology team who excavated Culduthel, many of them are my friends, and many of them are still digging. Most of them, well, many of them I'd say, are still in archaeology, yeah, they're absolutely fantastic. And this is what happens in archaeology. Look at this. What's this? 15, 16 years ago. Look how we all look younger. I took this photograph. There's Ross Murray, who directed the site. And without him, this book wouldn't exist, frankly. So many thanks to Ross. I'm just going to tell you a few of people and what they're doing now. So Ros Gillis is a European archaeologist now. She works in Berlin. Sarah Jane Haston is an environmental archaeologist. She works for the University of the Highlands and Islands. Daniel Salern, he works at Copenhagen Museum. Jürgen, he works for Headland. He's our head of innovation. Ali Robertson, he's a consultant archaeologist in London. Sophie, many of you will know Sophie Nichol. She works for Perth and Kinross Heritage Trust. Andy Bickett, he works for Wessex Archaeology. Is that everyone? I think that's your lot. And no, Magnar. There's Magnar hidden behind it. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Magnar. He's worked in Scottish archaeology for probably about 50 years. He only retired last year at the age of 75, and he probably taught all these people how to excavate. He is a wonderful, wonderful field archaeologist. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of represent the team there. There is more of them, but this is kind of the main crew that were on site and did such a fantastic job in untangling this unprecedented archaeology. So that all leaves me to say, don't ask me any complicated questions because it's 20 to 9 on a Friday night. But please, please feel free to ask me questions. And that is my email address. If anyone does want to get in touch and ask specific questions or anything that I'm not clear about tonight, I'd be grateful. You're more than welcome to get in touch. Thank you very much, guys.